Have you ever wanted to explore a bit more about the relationship between nutrition and the brain when it comes to neurodivergent children? Maybe this subject feels overwhelming, or perhaps you have spent a lot of time struggling with picky eaters and just don't know where to begin. Best-selling author of Brain Brilliance, naturopath, functional medicine practitioner and clinical lead of the NatureDoc team, Lucinda Miller is joining us today to help us understand the nutritional and metabolic interactions between the gut microbiome, the immune system and brain function. Now, this might seem a bit daunting, but I promise Lucinda will guide us through and explain the importance of all this when relating it to neurodivergent kids. Lucinda is passionate about children's nutrition and the neurodivergent mind. She has over 25 years of experience, and I know will give us a clearer understanding of this topic, leaving us feeling empowered and supported, whilst helping our kids to stay happy, healthy, and emotionally regulated. Today, we discuss nutrition and how it can impact a neurodivergent brain. Cryptopyrrole, I'm not going to explain this, but all I'm going to say is that you really need to listen out to find out more. It really is quite incredible. Creative ways to sneak in food for picky eaters, the power of omega-3 when it comes to supporting education, and why vitamins and minerals are such an important part of the puzzle when it comes to the neurodivergent brain. I really hope you enjoy listening. Lucinda, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you for being here. I also want to say thank you for your book, Brain Brilliance, which not only is filled with amazing recipes, it also is incredibly insightful into the nutritional needs for children with neurodiversity. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about you and how you've come to this point in your career of being such a pillar for families who are experiencing difficulties?
Izzy, it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me on. So I think really goes back to becoming a mum myself. So I've got 3 children and 2 of them do have ADHD. One has dyspraxia as well. So we are a neurodiverse family. However, I think right from the beginning, I realised there were so few resources for parents. I think so often, we don't have our family near us. My mum was actually in hospital when my son was born. So I had to go and visit her with my baby rather than her coming to look after us. So I had to navigate a lot on my own, and I found it really overwhelming and very hard to work out how to feed my child, how to raise my child, etc. And then I think I'm afraid, we are all prone to comparison, and you look at your friends' children and you think, is my child behaving like them? Are they on that sort of same kind of trajectory as them? And yes, I think I was very lucky that in the main my children were, but there were little niggles. And having had a diagnosis of ADHD myself, my husband also has a diagnosis, we knew that it was likely. And we did make jokes of it, but actually when it comes to actually parenting a child with ADHD, it can be a real challenge, even if you understand it yourself. And therefore, we had to navigate everything from mood swings to exhaustion to taking 3 hours to do a 20-minute homework, all of these things that just takes up so much time and effort and energy. And I think the biggest worry is about your child's future. Are they going to make friends? Are they going to fit in? Are they going to, get some academic achievements? Are they going to make a place in life? And you're not quite sure when they're really struggling. So I think most parents come to see us because they're stuck in a rut. They're finding there's a lot of accommodations being put in for their child for them to exist. And that often means that cuts them off from a lot of the rest of the world. It's difficult to travel, difficult to go out for meals. Just even getting out of the door to go to school is a real challenge and exhausting. But equally, I think a lot, especially probably with the more severe kids that we see, the kids with more significant developmental delay, they're just worried for their future. They're worried for their independence. They're worried for if they get unwell, is there someone that can care for them as well as they can? So I think there are a lot of worries as parents, but that's where nutrition can really help. And it's so vital, I feel, to really help keep someone stable, but also there are clever ways that you can kind of adapt the system to help children to cope better in the world. Maybe it's sleeping better, whether it's more energy, whether it's just better, working memory or processing or slightly better memory, or just being able to cope with the sensory overload from life.
I'm sure you have just spoken the words that are in a lot of parents' heads. So thank you for sharing that, Lucinda. There was a word you used when you were talking about parental mental health around bringing up children with neurodiversity. And the word you used was hypervigilant. And I think that is the key. That is what makes even our internal systems. You're on high alert. And what I found that so resonated about that was, if you imagine your bodies being in that state, and they're in that state 24/7, even through the night, because you don't know which child's going to pop up next to your bed in the middle of the night. You can't switch off from being hypervigilant. And so there are a lot of things within your book that actually, even though it will benefit the child, it will also benefit the parent and other children, if there are other children within the family.
Yes, I really agree, because what happened with me is I just went on overdrive with trying to help my children just enjoy life, And so then I wasn't enjoying life and I wasn't sleeping. So I'm very, very prone, and actually my daughter is as well, to a very high adrenaline state, which means, you go to bed and you're absolutely exhausted, and as you're brushing your teeth, that adrenaline kicks in and it's almost like you've just had a cup of coffee and you can't get to sleep. And then at 4 a.m, you're again wide awake. And just by sort of 6 o'clock, just as you're meant to be emerging out of bed, you just crash into a deep sleep because you're so exhausted. So I found that I got very, very burnt out, and that affected my immune system and, all sorts of things. I actually developed a sort of autoimmune condition at that point called Hashimoto's, which is a thyroid condition, which is very much more prevalent amongst the neurodivergent population. And so that's what's interesting. There's a lot of these things called comorbidities that go alongside neurodivergence, and you're more prone to things. So you don't need to be neurodivergent to develop autoimmune disease, but it's much more highly likely if you are neurodivergent. So yes, I got very, very burnt out by it. And actually, one of our biggest pieces of advice when we do see new clients within Nature.Clinic is to say you must look after yourself first. And often they don't take that advice.
It's really hard to do.
It is really hard to do when, you've got grab sleep, as you said, whether your child's neurodivergent or not. So when your children are tag teaming through the night, it's just exhausting. And I think a lot of parents exist on coffee and chocolate. And actually putting that oxygen mask on first really, really helps. And I think it's also the confidence that your child will start to adjust and become more balanced and find life easier. And I think that's where so many parents don't believe it to begin with. But and I'm not saying this is the story for everybody, of course it's not, but usually within about 6 weeks of changing the diet and starting on some basic supplements, we usually start to see a glimmer of where the parents look happier, they're more rested, they're less concerned. They kind of can see, a chink of light through the fog. And they're thinking, you know what? They came back excited from school. They've made a friend. They didn't have a detention, or whatever that might be, or they just went to bed happy, or they ate better. And I think that those things are so vital for the children. And then I think the parents can go, oh, I don't need to be quite so hypervigilant. And then that helps them to be calmer around their child as well.
And for those parents where you're in fight, flight, or I find freeze as well, that sort of numb state where it's almost too overwhelming that you don't know where to begin, that you actually can feel quite frozen in a state. What nutritionally would you suggest to a parent? What's a really good, nourishing sort of evening wind down smoothie or meal that you think could just help get that blood sugar settled, the cortisol settled?
Yes, so for the parents, if they're, obviously if they have a bit of hunger before bed and they have, that nibbly meat feeling, then probably I'd suggest some chamomile tea, but also maybe some cashew nuts and a banana, because those contain tryptophan, and tryptophan turns into melatonin, so it basically helps you switch off and wind down and calm. But my biggest tip is, if you are overstimulated, is to get into a lovely warm bath and to have 2 cups of Epsom salts in there, which you swish around. And the Epsom salts contain magnesium, and magnesium, basically that magnesium is absorbed through the skin, and it helps to make the most wonderful brain chemical called GABA. And GABA puts you into this lovely zen-like calm state. It's also just great for aches and pains and things like that as well.
And restless legs, which I really suffer from, which keep me awake.
That's horrible for you. So I think that's really important. I mean, my routine has been, since the children, and even though our children are now pretty much grown up, is, I do work late, which I know is not right, but it's all I can do really to cope at the moment, because we are so under so much pressure, which is great. It's lovely to have a thriving business, but so I often I'll go upstairs and I'll have this warm bath with the Epsom salts, and then I'll read, and actually that is really good. And sometimes I'll listen to a guided meditation.
Yeah, beautiful.
Because I actually find sometimes my brain's too busy for me to do it on my own.
Let's dive into the kids.
Yes.
I just really wanted to give parents a moment here just to check in with them, and just kind of give them a few resources, because it's a lot, as we've both agreed. But if we're diving into the kids, let's start the beginning of the day, which for many neurodivergent kids is very early in the morning. Why is that?
Basically, the sleep hormones, things like melatonin, as I said, which helps you get to sleep, but GABA, which helps you stay asleep. And also, neurodivergent kids are also very, very sensitive to even very small glitches in brain glucose. So a child doesn't need to actually go into a proper hypoglycemic state, which is a very low blood sugar state, but they can dip a bit, and that can wake them up as well. And also, some kids, they don't have that central nervous system development, which means they just need to do a pee quite early in the morning, and then they're woken up and they're ready to go. So there are lots of reasons why neurodivergent kids don't sleep very well. And it's probably our first thing that we work on if it's not optimized, because we all know that the brain heals overnight. So in the brain, we've got this incredible housekeeping system called microglia. And every night, basically, they get the brooms out and they start cleaning up the brain. And if you're not having that deep, deep sleep, then it's not going to do such a good job. So then the brain becomes more clogged and becomes more foggy, and less able to focus, concentrate, process, whatever. So sleeping is vital. And also it really does help with food choices the next day. We all know what it's like. If we've missed some sleep, we're going to grab the sugary things, aren't we? Which isn't going to serve us so well. So sleep is vital. And, sometimes their brain is just hyperactive and ready to go. But a lot of the kids find it difficult to get to sleep. So it's that sleep, schedule. So they can have the Epsom salt baths too. And I gave it to my kids when they were babies, but most time we recommend after 12 months. It's very good for sensitive skin, so it doesn't itch the skin like some of the magnesium flakes. And then, so yes, getting them into a really good routine to help them sleep is vital. Now, lots of neurodivergent kids will wake up and be quite hungry. And I find that very often the kids with the very bad blood sugar balancing, those ones that are really sensitive to blood sugar highs and lows, they wake up in a rage. They wake up absolutely livid, dysregulated. Sometimes what we suggest that parents do, which may not sound like a healthy habit, but it really helps to stabilise things until you can get the blood sugar better, is to have a snack beside their bed and a glass of water or a bottle of water, so that they are hydrated and they've got something just to perk them up, because they often wake up in a very low blood sugar state. So that can be really tough. The other thing is that a lot of ADHD kids are medicated, which can be vitally helpful for their educational journey. However, as soon as they take it, their appetite just gets blunted. And that may not come back till 4 or 5 in the afternoon. So they're often not even eating very much lunch either. And that can really impact on their growth and just generally their overall nutrition, because it's actually really hard to get enough vitamins and minerals in a child anyway, let alone if they're missing out pretty much on a meal a day. So my advice is, if they are medicated, is to make breakfast like a king. You know, eggs, Greek yogurt, lots of nut butters. Now, there are lots of kids who parents will say, I'm desperate to give them a good breakfast, but they're simply not hungry. And there are 2 main reasons for that we see. Obviously, there are other multiple reasons too, but these are the 2 main reasons. One is that they're in this high cortisol state. So as we were talking about the mummies and daddies being in a high cortisol state and a fight or flight freeze state, but so are the kids. You know, if they're emotionally dysregulated.
And too anxious to eat, perhaps, you know, if school is looming.
Yeah.
So they've got up, they've got out of bed, they may not have had a great night's sleep. Mm-hmm. And that has kind of built up through the week. They know they've got to get themselves up to school. And that morning can be quite a stressful time, both for the child and for the parent.
That's where things like magnesium, and then there are supplements like theanine and saffron, which are very calming and help to get them out of that high fight or flight state, which can actually be given the night before. So it helps them have a sort of deeper, calmer sleep, and they wake up calmer. So that's one reason why they might not be hungry in the morning. And the other one is this mineral that I talk about a lot, is zinc. And zinc is vital to help create that morning appetite. It sort of whizzes up your gastric juices. It turns on the sense of smell and taste. It kind of makes you feel hungry and food be pleasurable. And so that can be helpful. And that happens, especially that lack of morning appetite is especially so in the tween ages and the teenagers, who often are going through puberty and using up zinc more rapidly.
Right.
So if they will eat, then I think it's vital to think about protein and healthy fats. So they're things like, and most really good quality proteins also have really good healthy fats in them. So for instance, eggs. I love eggs. And eggs not only contain great amino acids, which make up protein, but it also contains something called choline. And choline helps to make a brain chemical or neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And that helps with things like memory, processing, self-regulation and emotional regulation.
Where can you sneak the eggs in?
So lots of kids don't like eggs. And I was going to go to that because I think a lot of people are in this thing, I'd love to give my child a couple of boiled eggs, but they really won't. Or they might have the yolk but not the white, or whatever it might be. So I think there are some really good tips. And there is one in Brain Brilliance, which has been a game changer for so many families. And that is, lots of kids love porridge. But porridge is generally just sort of oats and milk, or oats and water, maybe some sugar or honey or whatever. But what you can do is when you're cooking the oats, you crack an egg in. And you don't know it's there. It doesn't go like scrambled egg at all. It literally just looks a bit shinier and emulsified. And it gives the protein, the fat. And I promise you, then you can add things like nut butters, like things like almond butter and cashew nut butter don't really taste very much. And things like flax seeds and chia seeds can be ground up and again don't taste very much. So actually you could really build an incredibly healthy bowl of porridge. Eggs obviously go into pancakes, and lots of kids love pancakes, and waffles is another one. So yes, they might take a bit of time and you may want to prep them the night before or have them in your freezer. So you literally just sort of put them in the toaster and sort of defrost them and heat them up. But yeah, so that's great. And then Other ways to get egg in, which a lot of people forget about, is things like egg fried rice. Lots of kids quite like rice with maybe a bit of soy sauce and a bit of ginger or peas or whatever, but actually you can get an egg in there. And also kids are usually addicted to pasta. And actually I don't have a problem with pasta, especially the fresh pasta, which has egg in it. So unless they're allergic, these are great ways to get them in. They might not have the pasta at breakfast, but they'll be able to have it at different times of the day. So, and it takes 3 minutes rather than 11 minutes to cook. So it's a really speedy supper. So there are ways to get eggs in, but lots of kids can't do eggs for whatever reason. And they could have, sausages or bacon. I actually don't mind to begin with. When you're trying to get win your child round to this idea of eating something different at breakfast, find things that they really love. They might want some turkey slices. They might want Greek yogurt, Greek yogurt with granola and lots of seeds. So there are lots of ways of getting that protein in.
What is it about the protein that supports them once they've got into school?
There are sort of twofold, really. One is really to ground them more and to help with that blood sugar balance so that they're fuller for longer, more satiated. So a high protein breakfast has been associated with the sort of greater focus, better concentration for longer, than all the way through to lunchtime, rather than that sort of glitchy highs and lows which many children experience. And I think anyone that lives with a neurodivergent child sees that they're incredibly busy and their attention can be literally 20 seconds, at most. Whereas I think people are thinking, oh, my child doesn't concentrate for more than 5 minutes. And you think, oh, I dream of 5 minutes, So they're often very busy. So that really helps with that. But the other thing is that protein contains all these things called amino acids. And amino acids are these little building blocks that make the protein. And there are certain amino acids that help to make your neurotransmitters, things like dopamine, serotonin, etc. So there's something called tyrosine, which helps to make dopamine. And a lot of kids have ADHD and they struggle to make dopamine efficiently or to reuptake it to get it back into the system. So it's not going round and round in this lovely loop. It's kind of, as I said, quite glitchy. And so the tyrosine is the sort of foundation of making dopamine. And then you need a really important mineral called iron to convert that tyrosine into the dopamine. So essentially, that's where I think it's very vital for neurodivergent kids to eat red meat, because you've got the protein and you've got the iron at the same time. Now, some kids, some families won't or can't. They may be plant-based families or whatever, and that's totally okay, because actually you can get, black beans, for instance, have iron and protein too.
I'd love to ask you if you could wave a magic wand to all schools to make a change within what nutrition our children are getting to help them with their focus, their concentration, what would that magic wand be?
Well, I know this is taking away, obviously, budgets and things like that would get in the way. But a magic wand would be probably a lovely, calm dining hall with low lighting, kind of padding in the walls so that it's not too noisy, really organised queuing so that, the kids get the food quite efficiently. They have enough time to eat. Teachers are at their table, observing and making sure that they have a conversation and they, enjoy, make the meal fun. But from a nutrition perspective, I would just love there to be more protein, because they tend to, you hear they're having pasta or rice, and it tends to be a big pile of rice or pasta and a tiny little blob of, a few pieces of chicken, maybe 2 or 3, and a few veggies. And then there's a baguette on the side, and then there's a pudding afterwards. And none of these things are huge because they tend to be quite small plates, but the whole thing tends to be very carbohydrate driven. And that doesn't serve the neurodivergent brain that well. And I understand kids are fussy, and it's one of the most stressful situations the most stressful part of the day for teachers is lunchtime.
A typical food plate for a child with neurodiversity, obviously every child has their own food sensitivities and what they like and don't like. But usually it's a very beige plate. It's usually grouped in sections because they don't want it mixed together. huge aversion possibly to smell, what it looks like, the textures. What do you find happens once you have started to supplement these children with the vital vitamins and minerals that they're missing? What changes on that food plate? What do you see?
Ooh, lovely question. So, I mentioned earlier a mineral called zinc, and there have been really, really good studies done to find that kids that are dyslexic, ADHD, autistic, and these are separate studies, have universally been found. I'm not saying every single child with this, but these studies have found that they have a very high tendency to being born with a low zinc status.
Right.
And that means that is not meant to be a blame or shame thing, that it really complex genetics to synthesize zinc, and it's used for many pathways in the body. But it's the second most abundant mineral in your central nervous system, so it really does regulate. Imagine it's like the master regulator of your whole sort of nervous system. Now, what's interesting is if you're low in zinc, you tend to have a quite poor immune system. So it's often the child that was born, and developed some, they went straight back into hospital with some nasty infection or something like that. But it also really affects gastric juices, so sort of hunger. So it helps you digest, say, the milk when the baby's little. Equally, it helps with sense of smell and taste. But because of the nervous system influence, it also can affect the perception of texture in the mouth too. So essentially, food isn't a really fun experience. Nothing smells that nice, tastes that nice, or feels that nice. So then what happens is they get given something that's beige and crunchy, and suddenly they've got some sensory feedback. This is fun. And it could be, a piece of toast, it could be a nugget, it could be a piece of pizza, but it's like, oh, suddenly I quite like this. And so then they get rather sort of into that kind of food because it's actually giving them some stimulation. Otherwise, food is really dull. But what's amazing is so often when you supplement with the zinc, which can be tasteless drops that can go in apple juice or any kind of food, then over 6 to 8 weeks, you suddenly see the child find food a bit more interesting. So something there, they might be curious and just sort of start picking something off your plate, or not have a complete meltdown if you put a pea on their plate or whatever it might be. And slowly just their taste buds come back, their sense of smell comes back, and that perception of texture. And what's so funny is, I'm not saying every single time, but so often, 3-4 months down the line and they're eating so much better. And you say to them, you never really liked peas, or you never really liked, bolognese or whatever it is. Yes, I did. And they've almost got kind of memory amnesia, of that too. So it's not like they hold on to that thought that they never liked beetroot or they never liked, courgette or whatever. Once they like it, they usually come back. But what's interesting, as I said earlier, is when children go through a growth spurt, particularly puberty, the body uses a lot more zinc. And so that's often the stages. You often see it about sort of age 7 and 8, and then sort of 11 upwards, where suddenly they were quite a good eater, and then they're not. And it's usually, again, that says to me, that's a low zinc thing, because that's when they need a lot more.
I also read in the book another cause of low zinc is a disorder called cryptopyrrole. Could you talk to us a bit about this? Because I just found this absolutely mind-blowing.
So cryptopyrrole was basically discovered in the 1950s and 60s. So there was quite a lot of chit-chat about biochemistry and nutrition at that point. And then psychiatric medications and things like that came in. So actually it all got put on pause. And then in the last few years, there's been a lot more interest in this coming back. So there's this extraordinary void between sort of 1967 and sort of 2021. You know what I mean? And it's really, so this is why a lot of people haven't heard of it. But essentially, it is usually genetically acquired, which means there's usually kind of someone in the family, whether it's the parents, but it could be an uncle, grandparent, you can see generations above, where essentially it's a depletion sign. So it's where you pee out more zinc and vitamin B6 than you can possibly eat in your diet, unless you love oysters and things like that, which exactly. So it's really difficult to keep the levels up. And the typical presentation for this is where the child seems to be doing really quite well as a little one, and then maybe they start to get those symptoms of low zinc, like a little bit fussy eater, maybe their immune system's not great, etc., etc. But when you become even more depleted, because zinc and B6 are these really important nervous system regulators, the child starts to develop more mood swings, more emotional eating. They tend to become more socially withdrawn. So the child that is cryptoparole is often the child that you have to make a lot of adaptations for. It's walking around them as if on eggshells. Mm-hmm. Because you're never quite sure what their mood's like. And they often look incredibly well. They've often got beautiful porcelain skin, lovely bright eyes. They don't look like they're nutritionally depleted. So a lot of parents would think, oh, I don't think that's my child, but I know they have mood swings, and I know that they graze all day on rubbish, but they never eat properly, and they're often, on their own, on their iPad or in their room away from the rest of the family because they can't cope. They get overwhelmed by the family. Anyway, what can happen in later life is that can lead to more sort of greater mental challenges, which can lead to, bipolar. It can lead to addictions, depression, etc., purely because they're very dysregulated. But they often are also geniuses. So they're often people who are very good at something. And you often see it in the music world. You see it in the theatre world. You see it in artists, brilliant professors. Those brilliant professors who become more and more cantankerous and eccentric as they get older. It's almost like they seem a bit more pronounced in their kind of presentation. Anyway, this is because slowly but surely that zinc and B6 is being drained from them, unless, as I said, they're eating a supersonic diet, and maybe by chance they're taking a multivitamin or something like that with the zinc and B6 in it. So what we do with the children is we do a really simple urine test, and it's very affordable. And essentially that will tell whether this is a thing for them. And if it is, we put them on a slightly higher dose than the RDA of zinc and B6 for 3 months to observe whether we do see any changes in them. And what we usually see is they're calmer, they're eating better, they're more regulated. Just life is easier. You can get out of the house to the park, you can get out of the house to school. You're not making so many accommodations, and usually their taste buds are sort of revved up, which is exciting. So the things they've refused to have, like meat or eggs or whatever it might be, they're suddenly quite interested in it, and they're sleeping better. So, and then we probably then monitor things to see how they're going. But you might, when a child is growing, as I said, growth spurts and puberty, they might need to be on a sort of low level of both during that time so that they don't dip.
And what about sort of unknown infections that might be going on in the body? How do they impact children and their development?
Really good question, and something I have observed and have been super passionate about all the way along with my work. So, as we've all heard of something called the gut microbiome, and the gut microbiome is this amazing ecosystem within our bellies, which basically helps with everything from digestion to making B vitamins to helping with our immune system. It also helps to calm down something called inflammation. And inflammation, I think we've all heard about from COVID. You get this virus and you get this cytokine storm that whizzes around the body, and it causes this destruction on your cells called oxidative stress. Now, when that happens to the brain, that can alter how a child, or an adult thinks and feels. So it may put them into a low state, it may put them in an anxious state, an OCD state, etc. And so we do a lot of testing, which is urine testing mainly. Sometimes we'll do a blood test, but usually it's urine, to understand where those microbes are, if there are any underlying bacterial infections or viral infections that are driving this. Because the most well-documented kind of link with this is with a bacterial infection called streptococcus. Streptococcus can cause scarlet fever, tonsillitis, strep throat, and it whizzes around schools. And, most kids are pretty sick with it. And, they're probably on antibiotics for it. Now, in most cases, those kids will be absolutely fine afterwards. And you might want to think about some probiotics, but other than that, move on, all good. But with a child, they don't need to be a neurodivergent, but, or obviously so, but they may just have this thing called immune dysregulation, where their body doesn't deal with the infection very easily. So what will happen is that streptococcus, instead of the immune system going, hello, streptococcus, I'm going to fight you, and then go, I'm going to put you in my library and remember I've had you before, which is how we kind of think of the immune system working. Instead, that streptococcus goes, hello, brain. And it goes, I'm going to completely muddle up the brain. And it hits this thing at the back of the brain called the basal ganglia. And that can lead to sudden onset, which could be overnight, but it could be developing over several weeks. And I would say that there are some autistic kids that are in that kind of loop for a very long time without it being obvious, because the autism is another layer which sort of masks it a bit. But essentially it's normally a sort of pretty neurotypical child who suddenly changes and develops, as I said, anxiety, OCD, often social withdrawal, often like things like their handwriting, their art suddenly goes backwards. So the writing might go from sort of beautiful cursive writing to sort of back to front tempy pieces, or, a beautiful picture of the parents would then just go into a squiggle, things like that. So this is because the streptococcus can be misdirected into the brain rather than being fought by the immune system. And this is something called PANDAS. But other viral infections and other bacterial infections can drive this just as much. So that is known as PANS, because it's without the streptococcus. And that can be anything from COVID to mold in your house to, all sorts of random infections. So that's a cohort of children we look after quite a lot. And the average age of that onset is about 9. So often they're perfectly happy, healthy and well, and then suddenly they've developed this sort of extreme mental health challenges, within a few weeks. And they might not have even obviously been unwell. So it may be their best friend or their sibling that's been ill, and they've changed, and it's just been like a confusion about why. Anyway, the great news is that there is now a fabulous clinic in central London, a medical team who can prescribe things like antibiotics and so forth to help with that strep infection. And what we do in our clinic is sometimes the child has kind of had enough of the antibiotics have run out as such, or for whatever reason they're not working as well or whatever, and then we see them as well. And so we work on the immune system, and we work on the immune system for about 2 years to help them whenever they do pick up an infection, that they don't get another kind of, it's known as a flare, where all the symptoms come flooding back. So that's really vital. So I fundamentally believe that there should be a lot more research, and there is a lot of research going on, but I'm just saying I think it's a very high priority, and I think COVID has accelerated this, where infections and mental health challenges are observed better, because it could simply be an antibiotic or, as I said, some natural things that could stabilise someone again.
So when you've got a neurodiverse child, you've already got a layer, and then you add these other layers, whether it's, infection, or we were talking about cryptopyrrole. And it's this concoction that they're having to manage within their bodies.
I've been doing this for nearly 30 years. It's 30 years this year. And I think so often parents think there is no solution to this. This is something we're going to have to live with, or our child's going to live with forever. But what we try and do is to find out why. So, for instance, with a fussy eater, you can think, have they got really poor oral tone? So they haven't got the right muscles to chew and swallow. So it might be why they're choosing melt-in-the-mouth food, because actually they're scared of choking. Okay? Really simple.
But they can't communicate.
They can't communicate it necessarily, but they're just saying, I don't like it, or pushing it away because they know it's not. Sometimes kids have reflux. They have extreme constipation, so they feel really sick and sort of sludgy inside. Very often there are unknown allergies because they don't get swollen lips or whatever, but they feel funny inside whenever they eat that food. So they've associated that food with it's not right. But, then you've got the things like the low zinc, but also low iron. Low iron gives you a sore mouth and a sore tummy. So your appetite sort of melts away. And I find that children prefer not to eat or to have a very limited diet rather than to be adventurous when there's something in the way. So I'm not saying we've got the answer for everybody. Of course we haven't. But I think once you can reignite those taste buds, sense of smell, digestive juices, then it can make an enormous difference to the child. And, there may be something simple that is blocking them. And that's all my message is that don't give up.
What struck me through reading Brain Brilliance, and what I love about the book, is that at the beginning you've got such a wedge of information before you get to the recipes. It's such a brilliant combination of getting that understanding and then being able to action it. There are a lot of vitamins and minerals that actually support many factors that might be going on. And one of them was the omega-3 that kept coming up for me with kind of educational support. So whether that was dyslexia, speech and language, noise sensitivities, reading and writing, focus, concentration, and omega-3 kept coming up. Why is that?
Ooh, really good question. So there's been incredible research into omega-3. I think if you do any deep dive into nutrition, the child brain development, neurodivergence, you usually will come up with omega-3. And this is the main research that's been done in the UK is Dr. Alex Richardson, who's based at Oxford, and an amazing professor, Michael Crawford, who's turning 95 this year and is still working and has a very sharp brain. So something's working with him. And they together have written, I don't know how many, probably hundreds of papers on the importance of omega-3, not just for the child's brain, but to be, even in preconception, pregnancy, breastfeeding, because we have a very fatty brain. I know we don't you can't imagine it, but you can imagine all the white, that's it, there is fat in the brain. And a very high proportion of that is omega-3. And the really important part of that omega-3 is a type of omega-3 called DHA. And DHA helps with eye development and brain development. So if you've got a child that's dyslexic or struggling with reading, any kind of academic work where that they need to have visual capacity, then DHA may be helpful. The other thing is this brain development. So it does really help with things like that central nervous system development. So, for instance, bedwetters. There was a study done. So I think they were 7 to 13-year-olds who were still bedwetting. And they took omega-3 and something called vitamin D together for 8 weeks, and most of them were dry by the end, which is phenomenal because it helps that central nervous system to catch up. So it's very good for any child that has any kind of developmental delay of any sort. But what the main part of omega-3 that I think is vital is, yes, it does nourish the brain, and it helps basically all the cells in the brain to be more flexible. And I think one of the biggest challenges with neurodivergence is an inflexible brain, that inflexible thought process. They tend to become quite rigid, especially the autistic kids. And so omega-3 does help flexibility of brain, which is helpful. But what it does is it helps to mature the prefrontal and frontal cortex, which is the front part of your brain. It's behind your forehead. And this is the area of the brain that takes longer to develop. So in girls, that part of the brain tends to be fully developed by the age of about 21, 22. With boys, it tends to be more like 24, 25. And in neurodivergent kids, it can be 5 to 7 years delayed. So that's often why neurodivergent people suddenly are these late bloomers, and they become really kind of like proactive and enthusiastic and kind of switched on in their 30s and 40s rather than, earlier on. Anyway, the prefrontal cortex and frontal cortex help with so many aspects of neurodivergence, from executive function, which is organisation, planning, etc., but also things like working memory, processing, focus. So that's a part of the brain that really needs support, and that's where omega-3 really helps. So that's eating, in theory, lots of lovely salmon, sardines, mackerel, anchovies, but also seafood. Could be prawns or crab or whatever, which is brilliant. But as we know, we have some very fussy kids that usually don't like those strong tastes for whatever reason. There are lots of kids with fish and shellfish allergies as well. So, you can't always go in with that. So yes, there are vegetarian forms. So there's walnuts, chia seeds, flax seeds and hemp seeds. However, they contain the ALA form, which has to convert in the body into the DHA, and that's really hard to do. So only about 10% gets converted in a really healthy body. And then, unfortunately, babies, male population, and anyone that has maybe a zinc deficiency, B vitamin deficiency, magnesium deficiency, or has a diet full of lots of ultra-processed foods, may only convert that by 1%. So if you are plant-based, it is absolutely vital to take a marine algae-based omega-3, which is vegan, and it's the algae that the fish eat to then make the omega-3. So it is a very good source of omega-3. And if you are fish eaters or are able to eat fish for whatever reason, then again, I would suggest a fish oil supplement, especially if your child seems to be developmentally delayed. And some of the signs, now this is not 100% reason for taking omega-3, but I think it's a really good kind of barometer, is very dry hair, very dry skin. So often the sort of eczema-y child. So the sort of asthma-y child too, so dry lungs. So the sort of dryness, sort of inflexibility, the skin's sort of quite tight. But the biggest sign, which has had the most research, and this is what Alex Richardson talks about quite a bit, is something which a lot of people have, called keratosis pilaris, which is chicken skin at the top of your arms. Now, most doctors would say, oh, you just need some cream, it's genetic, that's all you need. But actually, it can be exacerbated by a lack of omega-3. And so taking the omega-3, you can observe if your child has these bumps on their arms. It can be on their face, it can be the top of their legs and their bellies as well.
And it's like a sort of sandpaper, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like it sort of presents in bumps, kind of rough.
Exactly. Yeah. Just dry and bumpy and a little bit rough. Anyway, often what happens is kids will take it for, say, a good quality fish oil that's been, really lovely and potent and good and strong. Within 3 months, their skin is smoother, but also their eyes are shinier, they're more switched on, they're calmer. There have been studies about omega-3 and sleep, for instance. It just helps that whole central nervous system sort of calm down. So it's definitely something to think about. And my other tip for omega-3, because a lot of people say, look, I don't think I'm going to achieve that with the food, is that if you buy whole organic milk, so cows that have been feeding off grass, then the milk will have more omega-3 in it. And equally their meat, if they've been outdoor reared and eating grass, they will have more omega-3 and more vitamin D in the meat too. So actually just choosing better quality versions of what they're eating already can help too.
Lucinda, summarising the key vitamins and minerals that we're talking about here that are going to help and support the neurodivergent brain, could you just sort of top line what you've seen in your profession over many, many years have kind of been the key vitamins and minerals?
So, first of all, if you cook from scratch, you have a lot more autonomy over what ingredients go into your child's food. And therefore, you can think, I want zinc-rich foods or magnesium-rich foods, etc. And, so you can do a lot through food. But as we know, there's usually, whether they're super fussy, got ARFID, etc., or whether, they're just a little bit highly selective and not very excited about new foods. So that's where the supplements, as I said, can be scaffolding. So the key ones, obviously omega-3, really vital. Mm-hmm. And the way to spot that, as I said, is usually the chicken skin. Mm-hmm. Okay. Then the next one is the zinc. I think that's really, really important. And one sign for low zinc, as well as all the sort of mood swings and low appetite and, fussy eating and things, is often white speckles on the nails. Now, that can mean other mineral deficiencies too, but it's one of the big ones that comes up. And I've written a big blog about that, so anyone can read about any of these on my blog as well as in Brain Brilliance. Then the other one is iron. So iron, if you're very low, you might become anemic, but there are a lot of children who are not anemic, but they still don't have quite enough iron in their system. And that's actually the most abundant mineral in your central nervous system. So it's actually in some ways more vital than zinc. And that you would spot a child who tends to be very pale. They often have quite pale nails. They often are very tired. And they tend to be quite kind of moody, low, sullen. Those are the sorts of words that are describing a low kind of iron person, because essentially the iron helps to pump oxygen around the body and the brain. So that's really vital. And then I think there's magnesium. And magnesium is just fantastic for sleep, restless legs, growing pains, tics and twitches, constipation, kind of dysregulation. It's just very nice and calming. So those are the ones I'd start with.
Mm-hmm. In Brain Brilliance, we have, as a family, tried so many of your yummy recipes. But I really want to give a big shout out to the chicken nuggets, which I managed to sneak in. Well, so there's red lentil. I've never given my child red lentil, or even contemplated putting that on its plate. And that's all three of them. Red lentil, egg, ground almonds, oregano, paprika. Those flavours, I cannot believe all my children wolfed down your chicken nuggets. So thank you. We then followed that on with your raspberry chocolate mug cake. And I'm no baker, so your recipes are just so simple. I can do it. We did it together. And again, massive hit. The other one, which is the cherry and the chamomile smoothie. Is that what it's called?
It's the cherry and chamomile sleepy smoothie. Which we all needed in abundance. And honestly, if you had asked me before I sort of started looking at this journey for my children about what's actually going on nutritionally, that cut to however many weeks later and I put that on their plate, I was flabbergasted that and I just think that goes to show the amazing things you are doing for not just the children, but actually the families. Because as we know, it's an incredibly demanding, challenging place to be. So thank you, Lucinda. And I really highly recommend, if there is one thing you do, read Brain Brilliance from beginning to end to really understand just how important this piece of the puzzle is. Because these children, they may be having extra therapy, speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, one-to-one support at school, and you're sort of fitting all these puzzles together. But this is such a key part of the puzzle, and I'm just so grateful. So thank you, Lucinda. Thank you, Izzy. It's been such a fantastic chat, and keep on being amazing.
Yeah. That's it for this episode of Let's Talk Neurodivergent Kids. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please do subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with anyone who might find it helpful. Your support really means so much and helps us to reach more families navigating the world with their neurodivergent children. I'd also really love to hear from you, so you can get in touch via email, that's hello@letstalkndkids.com, or message me on @Let'sTalkNDKids on Instagram. Thanks for listening, and join me next time on Let's Talk Neurodivergent Kids.